Welcome back to Chain Reaction, where we cut through the noise and hand you the data before the crowd figures it out. If you're here for real analysis, not recycled Twitter threads, you're exactly where you need to be. Here's the uncomfortable question that nobody in the XRP community is asking right now. XRP just had its worst quarter in 8 years. Q1 2026 wiped out nearly $29 billion in market cap. And that happened while the SEC and CFTC jointly classified XRP as a digital commodity, while spot ETFs were pulling in record inflows, and while Ripple was signing partnerships left and right. So how does a token lose that much ground when everything is supposedly going right? And more importantly, what does that tell us about where XRP is actually headed? Most people will give you the easy answer. They'll blame macro headwinds, point to Bitcoin's sideways action, or tell you it's just a temporary dip before the moon. But here's the angle that nobody wants to sit with. XRP might be experiencing something far more structural than a market dip. It could be caught in what I'm calling a catalyst gap, and understanding that gap is the only way to know whether you're holding a sleeping giant or a permanently delayed promise. Let me show you what I mean by building this from the ground up, starting with where the institutional money is actually flowing, then showing you what's missing from the equation, and finally laying out the three-part framework that will tell us definitively whether XRP's utility thesis holds. Start with the capital flows because the numbers here are genuinely interesting. 7 US spot XRP ETFs launched between September and December 2025. Together they pulled in $1.44 billion in inflows. Then, just for the week ending April 11th of this year, CoinShares reported an additional $119.6 million in net inflows to XRP investment products. The strongest weekly number since December 2025. Exchange-held XRP balances have dropped to 7-year lows, so the buy pressure is real. Institutions are not walking away. In fact, a Coinbase survey conducted with Ernst & Young, covering 351 institutional investors most managing above $1 billion, found that 25% plan to add XRP to their portfolios in 2026. Another 18% already hold it. Here's what makes this paradox so revealing. All of that capital is flowing in, and the price is still down 63% from its July 2025 high of $3.65. How? Because the money is going into ETF structures, into custody, into regulated vehicles, and almost none of it is translating into on-chain XRP demand. Institutions are betting on XRP's future without actually using the XRP ledger today, and that distinction is everything. This is where Ripple's own CTO David Schwartz gives us the most honest framework in the entire XRP conversation. He has said publicly that adoption of the XRP ledger is measured by transaction volume and liquidity depth, not by price or ETF inflows. The XRP ledger has processed over 4 billion transactions in its history, but monthly transaction volumes have actually been declining over the past 2 years. So you have institutional money piling into XRP on one side and the actual network sitting underutilized on the other. That is the catalyst gap. Now let me tell you what is supposed to close that gap and why the timing of this specific legislative window matters more than almost anything else. The Clarity Act passed the U.S. House of Representatives in July 2025 with a bipartisan vote of 294 to 134. It then stalled in the Senate over a dispute about whether stablecoins should be allowed to pay yield. The Senate went on Easter recess on March 30th without scheduling a markup. Senators return on April 13th. The Banking Committee, chaired by Tim Scott, has a targeted markup window in the final 2 weeks of April. Senator Bernie Moreno has been explicit: if the bill does not reach the full Senate floor by May midterm election, dynamics will kill it for the rest of 2026. Why does this matter so much for XRP specifically? Because right now XRP's commodity classification exists only as an interpretive release jointly issued by the SEC and CFTC on March 17th. That means a future administration could reverse it. Banks know this. Large asset managers know this. And they will not commit capital to on-demand liquidity corridors, to Rust integration, or to XRP-based cross-border settlement infrastructure on the basis of an administrative determination that has no statutory permanence. The Clarity Act makes the commodity classification federal law. That single shift is what converts Ripple's 300-plus bank partnerships from exploratory relationships into active network participants. Without it, those partnerships stay in pilot phase, Rust settles in fiat channels, and XRP stays range-bound. Standard Chartered's Jeffrey Kendrick has modeled this out. If the Clarity Act clears committee, the bank projects for $28 billion in additional XRP ETF inflows, pushing price above $1.60 and potentially toward prior cycle highs. If the bill stalls past May, Standard Chartered already cut their year-end target from $8 down to $2.80 at best. And if Bitcoin simultaneously breaks below 60,000, the floor for XRP could be as low as 82 cents. Polymarket currently puts the Clarity Act's odds of passing in 2026 at 63 to 66%. Ripple CEO Brad Garlinghouse has already moved his own expected timeline from end of April to end of May. The window is real, and it is narrow. But here is the piece of the puzzle that even seasoned XRP analysts are underweighting. The Clarity Act is not the only lever in play this month. Ripple's leadership is currently in Japan at the XRP Tokyo 2026 conference, focused specifically on real-world asset tokenization. The SEC is also holding a Clarity Act roundtable. On April 16, just 3 days after the Senate returns, these events are not ceremonial. They represent the convergence of legislative pressure, executive engagement, and live institutional business development all happening simultaneously. And the technology is not standing still either. Ripple's 2026 roadmap, revealed at Community Day in February, is shifting the XRP ledger from a payments rail into what they are calling a full institutional-grade DeFi operating system. The XLS66 amendment introduces a native lending protocol, allowing XRP to be deposited into single-asset vaults for fixed-term, fixed-rate lending directly on the ledger. No wrapping, no bridging. Over $100 billion in currently dormant XRP could become productive capital through this mechanism. The multi-purpose token standard, also launching in 2026, is purpose-built for tokenizing real-world assets. Permissioned markets and confidential transfers are being added to satisfy regulated finance compliance requirements. This is not incremental development, this is an architectural transformation. Ripple itself is now structurally positioned inside the traditional banking system in a way it has never been before. In December 2025, it received conditional approval from the Office of the Controller of the Currency for a national trust bank charter, the first crypto-native company to reach this milestone. The company has applied for a Federal Reserve Master Account, which would give Ripple National Trust Bank direct access to Fedwire and FedNo and allow it to hold Ripple dollar reserves at the central bank. Ripple itself has surpassed $1.3 billion in market cap, backed by reserves held at Binary Melon, and is already integrated into Visa-linked payment pilots and Ripple Prime's prime brokerage operations. More than $2.7 billion in acquisitions across hidden road, rail and treasury have built out clearing, settlement and treasury management capabilities that now run through XRP ledger infrastructure. Here is my honest read on what all of this adds up to. The infrastructure argument for XRP is now the strongest it has ever been. The regulatory argument is the strongest it has ever been. The institutional interest is measurable and growing, but none of that has translated into on-chain network activity yet, and the price reflects that gap with brutal clarity. XRP is down 63% from its peak even as every institutional metric points upward. That is not suppression. That is the market pricing in a very specific risk. The risk that all this infrastructure and all these partnerships never convert into actual XRP ledger usage at the scale the thesis requires. The catalyst gap will close one of two ways. Either the Clarity Act passes in April or May, banks get permanent legal cover to use XRP as a bridge asset, and on-demand liquidity volumes begin to compound alongside Ripple growth, at which point the price discovery phase becomes driven by genuine network demand rather than speculative inflows. Or the bill stalls, institutions continue parking capital in ETF structures without touching the ledger, and XRP spends the rest of 2026 moving with macro sentiment instead of its own fundamentals. The three things I am watching closely right now are first, the Senate Banking Committee markup in late April, specifically whether Tim Scott schedules it before the May deadline. Second, any partnership or volume announcements coming out of XRP Tokyo 2026, particularly around ODL corridor expansion in Asian payment markets where remittance volumes are highest. Third, the XLS66 lending protocol vote, because if that amendment activates and XRP holders start turning yield directly on the ledger, the demand dynamic for the token changes in a way that has nothing to do with legislation or ETF flows. 72% of global financial institutions say they need digital asset solutions to stay competitive. Ripple has built the most complete stack to serve that demand, but a stack without users is just architecture. The next 60 days will tell us whether the XRP ledger finally becomes the network that matches its infrastructure, or whether we are still waiting for the usage to catch up to the promise. I will be tracking every data point and breaking it down here as it develops. Subscribe if you want the real signals, and if XRP's on-chain numbers start moving, I'll be the first to tell you exactly what it means.